Welcome to episode 29 of the 3am Fear podcast. It was the morning of May 25th, 1979, and the Patz household in Manhattan's SoHo district was bustling with activity. Stanley and Julie Patz, along with their three children, Shira Patz, age 8, Etan, age 6, and Ari Patz, age 2, were getting ready for their day ahead. Ethan loved to get his picture taken. He was a jolly boy with a zest for life. Julie, who ran a daycare center out of her home, was preparing breakfast for her family and getting her children ready for school. Etan, who was only 6 years old, had been asking his parents if he could walk himself to the bus stop since the school bus strike had ended. With the buses scheduled to resume service that day, the Patz family finally gave in and allowed Etan, for the first time, to walk by himself to the bus stop. Etan was a good boy. It was a close-knit neighborhood and the residents always looked out for each other. So Julie wasn't worried. He dressed in all blue that day, blue pants, blue corduroy jacket, and blue sneakers with distinctive fluorescent stripes along the side. He also carried a blue cloth bag with an elephant pattern on the fabric. As usual, he was wearing his black future flight captain pilot's cap, which covered his straight light brown hair. He pulled it down low to his brow, shading his blue eyes. He wore his prized cap, which he had bought at a flea market for 10 cents. Julie walked Etan down to the street and gave him $1 for a soft drink at the local bodega. As Etan walked away, Julie watched him until he reached the first corner at Wooster Street. She then walked back upstairs, confident that Etan could make it the rest of the way himself. It was just 150 feet to the bus stop. She wasn't worried. She had no idea that this was going to be the last time she would see her son alive. Hello and welcome to the 3am Fear podcast. I'm Nikita Ferrao, mystery and thriller author. On this podcast, I talk about real crimes and real people. Due to the graphic nature of some of this content, listener discretion is advised. You can find the episode show notes on my website 3amfear.com. Let's get started. As Etan stood on the corner of Wooster and Prince, waiting to cross the relatively quiet intersection, a nearby woman and a male man noticed him. They were the last people to see Etan Patz. When the school bus arrived at the West Broadway stop at 8:10 a.m., a group of children got on. But Etan wasn't one of them. His first grade teacher noticed his absence later that morning at the Independence Plaza School on Greenwich Street, but failed to report it to the principal's office. It wasn't until that afternoon that Julie Patz discovered that her son was missing. The school bus returned to the West Broadway stop at 3:15 p.m. and the neighbor who always picked up Etan along with his daughter was puzzled when Etan didn't get off the bus. His daughter informed him that Etan hadn't been to school that day, and he wondered why didn't Julie or Stanley call him and let him know that Etan wasn't going to be there. On the other end, Julie Patz paced back and forth in her loft, worrying about her son. He should have been home by now. She called the neighbor who usually escorted him and was shocked to learn that he hadn't been in school that day. Without hesitation, Julie immediately called the police and then her husband, who raced home. NYPD detective William Butler received the call from his dispatcher at around 5:15 p.m. and along with his partner drove directly to the Patz loft. As soon as he spoke to parents, he knew that this was not your typical child loss situation. Butler had seen cases where children wandered off or played hooky, but he had a gut feeling that this wasn't it. Etan didn't go somewhere on his own. The search began that evening with nearly 100 officers combing the area, knocking on doors and searching rooftops and basements. The Patz apartment was used as a temporary command post, and Julie and Stanley hovered over the phone, praying for their son to call. The police stood by in case a kidnapper called with a ransom demand. As the night wore on and the rain started to fall, Julie was concerned because Etan had only left his house with a light jacket. Detective Butler quietly worried that the rain would wash away any potential scent for tracking dogs. Bloodhounds were being brought in from upstate, and they wouldn't arrive until 8 a.m. the next morning. He hoped that there would be at least something for the bloodhounds to work on, something for them to smell. When the bloodhounds finally arrived, they were given a pair of pajamas to identify the subject, and they were sent in the streets with their handlers. Everyone waited anxiously for the news. The search area was expanded to encompass the entire lower end of Manhattan, and police helicopters hovered over the search zone, scanning rooftops while police boats scoured the waterways. The police appealed to the public for any tip that could lead them to the boy. Toll-free telephone numbers were also set up. Neighborhood residents helped in the search, papering the city with colored posters. On Sunday, May 27th, a witness came forward who claimed to have seen a boy who fit Etan's description walking to a suspicious-looking man 3 blocks from the corner of the street where Julie had last seen her son. Under hypnosis, the witness described the man as white, about 40 years old, with freckles and dyed blonde hair. But this couldn't be taken as a strong lead because the witness himself wasn't sure if the boy was Etan or not. He had just seen a boy. The media jumped on the story and propagated several leads, but on June 6th, 13 days after he disappeared, the emergency response was terminated. Etan Patz's disappearance remained an open case, but most of the officers who had taken part in the search were eventually reassigned to other cases. Detective Butler, however, remained fixated on this case. He drove down Prince Street every morning at 8 a.m., hoping something would occur to him. Maybe he had missed something, maybe he would see something that would trigger something in him. He visited the scene every morning for years, and Julie Patz took comfort while looking out of the window and seeing this car passing by, knowing that there was at least one person out there who was still looking out for a son. If the case was still active, Etan might still be alive. But weeks turned into months, months turned into years, and there was still no sign. Etan became the first missing child to be featured on a milk carton. After years of searching for leads, detectives in the Bronx stumbled upon a strong lead in 1982. They had arrested Jose Antonio Ramos, a known drifter who sold cheap jewelry and small toys on the streets to get by. Ramos stood at 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighing 180 pounds, with long graying hair and beard that hung down to his chest. In the search for the drainage tunnel where Ramos had been living, police found several photographs of young boys, most of them with light-colored hair similar to that of Etan. For the first time after a long while, the detectives felt like they had stumbled across something that might get them closer to solving the case. Detectives questioned Ramos about his interest in young boys and asked him if he knew anything about Etan. He denied knowing anything about the missing child, but mentioned that he knew a woman who used to walk Etan to the bus stop every morning during the school bus strike. Detectives urged Ramos to explain his relationship with this woman who worked with the Patz family. The case had now shifted to suspicion. But Ramos refused to say anything. During the interrogation, Ramos revealed that he had suffered a nervous breakdown in 1979. He claimed that he had been hearing a voice in his head that tried to force him to get violent, but he was trying his best to hold back. He said that he had to do a lot of forceful holding back because he was ready to explode. However, Ramos said nothing more. Etan's detectives tracked down the woman who had been hired to walk him to the bus stop during the strike. She admitted to seeing a man named Ramos in 1979 who had been renting an apartment on the Lower East Side. The woman broke down in tears as she revealed that Ramos had only been interested in her because he wanted to get to her younger son. He had molested her son on several occasions. However, she never reported Ramos to the authorities and he was released due to lack of evidence. Years later, in 1985, federal prosecutor Stuart Grabois was assigned to the Patz case. He was given instructions from his boss, the then US Attorney Rudy, to do whatever it took to get a conviction. Grabois pored over old files and decided that Ramos deserved further investigation. At that time, Ramos was serving a sentence in Pennsylvania for an unrelated child molestation conviction. Grabois arranged for Ramos to be brought to New York for questioning, and two detectives from the NYPD Missing Persons Squad, Robert Shaw and Daniel Cavallo, sat in the interview. Ramos was read his Miranda rights and offered a lawyer, but he declined, saying that he didn't need one because he had become a jailhouse lawyer while he was sitting in prison. Apparently, he had read up a lot on criminal law while he was in prison. Now he was a self-proclaimed jailhouse lawyer who was giving advice, legal advice, to other inmates. Ramos thought that the authorities wanted to talk to him about tax evasion. He was in good spirits before the interview began. He was even looking forward to matching his wits with the authorities. At first, he was asked about his childhood, then some basic questions about his prison experiences. And when Grabois thought that Ramos was comfortable, he dropped the bomb. He asked Ramos how many times he had sex with Etan Patz. As soon as he heard the name Etan, he became visibly rattled and started to sob. Ramos admitted to seeing a boy who fits Etan's description in Washington Square Park, just 4 blocks north of the Patz home in SoHo. Ramos described the boy's distinctive blue sneakers with bright straps and said that he had invited this boy into his apartment to watch television. During the interview, Ramos claimed that he had taken this boy, whom he thought may have been Etan Patz, to his apartment for sex and later released him that day. He said that he left the boy on a subway to visit his aunt in Washington Heights. But the Patz family had no relatives there. Ramos claimed that he saw some news reports for the search of Etan and he himself went to help search for this boy. But Grabois had a gut feeling that Ramos was responsible to whatever happened to this boy. Grabois and his detectives expressed their disbelief, but Ramos clung to his story. When news reports about the search for Etan started airing on television, Ramos said that he suddenly became 90% sure that the boy he had taken to his apartment was the missing child. He insisted that he left his apartment to join the search for this boy, but Grabois suspected that Ramos had not parted ways with Etan the way that he said. He had a gut feeling that if Ramos hadn't murdered the boy to eliminate him as a witness, he may have sold the boy to another child molester or maybe an illegal adoption broker, but not the way that Ramos was telling that he had left the boy at the subway. Grabua pressed Ramos to come clean, but the man wouldn't say much more than what he had already told them about Etan. He finally said that he wanted to tell Grabua everything and that he needed a lawyer present. By law, Grabua had to terminate the interrogation until Ramos was provided with legal representation. Later, as Ramos was escorted out of the office, he told Detective Shaw that when he finally told them everything, by that I mean every single thing that he had to say, Shaw would get a promotion and become famous. But Ramos never actually made a full confession. He had subsequent interrogations, but he never made a full confession. He flitted around with the issue, but basically stuck to his original story that he took the boy in for sex, and when the boy was not ready, he let the boy go. In 2004, 25 years after Etan vanished, a New York judge ruled that Ramos was responsible for the boy's death. But the police and prosecutors had no proof, and the charges could not be brought against him. Still, Grabua was not ready to let go of Ramos. The Patz family deserved to know what happened to their son, and Grabua was ready to do anything to get Ramos to talk. Now let's get to know Ramos a little better. According to crimelibrary.org, Jose Antonio Ramos was a Puerto Rican American born in the Bronx on July 23, 1943. He was the oldest of 5 brothers, but his childhood was far from idyllic. Ramos claimed to have sexual relations with one of his brothers when they were children, and he even said that he was molested by an uncle. After dropping out of high school, Ramos enlisted in the Navy in 1960. He boasted of having received decorations and commendations during this time in the Navy, and even claimed to have held an executive position in the New York advertising firm. However, there is no proof to back any of these up. By the early 70s, Ramos had become a drifter, wandering around the country, making a living selling used merchandise on the streets. Over the years, he had been arrested several times in different states for different crimes. These included burglary, battery, and indecent exposure. In 1982, Ramos was arrested in Bronx for allegedly luring young boys into this makeshift drainage tunnel residence of his. The police were unable to get enough evidence against Ramos, and just 5 months later, he was arrested again, this time at a video game arcade in Times Square for propositioning 3 young boys between the age of 9 and 12. Charges were filed against Ramos but later dropped because the boys, although they seemed street tough, were not ready to talk against Ramos. Despite his shady past, Ramos continued to prey on innocent children. The year was 1983, and the Rainbow family, a diverse group of hippies, New Agers and free spirits, had gathered at the Watersmeet, Michigan for their annual convocation. Among the attendees was Ramos, who was spotted handing out Star Wars figurines and trading cards to children at Kid Village. This behavior raised some concerns among the caregivers. They alerted the Rainbow family's internal security force, the Shanti Sena, and upon their request, Ramos left the gathering without any resistance. 2 years later, Ramos resurfaced at the annual Rainbow family gathering in Mark Twain Forest, Missouri. He was accompanied by a light-haired teenage boy, and the duo arrived in a 1978 blue Ford school bus that Ramos had purchased at an auction in Coconut Grove, Florida. Once again, he was seen hovering around Kid Village, doling out small toys and trinkets to children. The Shanti Sena, who still remembered him from the previous visit, promptly took his picture and kept a close eye on him. While at the gathering, Ramos befriended a group from Erie, Pennsylvania, and their 2 boys. After the Rainbow family reunion, Ramos began showing up at this couple's house unannounced and on multiple occasions. Each time he offered a helping hand on whatever work they wanted around the house. They needed painting, car repairs, anything you name it, Ramos was ready to help. Eventually, the couple grew to trust him and he became kind of like a part of their family. That was until years later they discovered that Ramos was actually molesting one or both of their children while still under his care. The following year, there was another convention in Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest. As usual, there were a lot of children around, and this time too, Ramos was there. The Shanti Sena spotted Ramos, whom they remembered from all their previous gatherings, hanging around Kid Village and handing out toys and trinkets to the kids. Ramos was with a light-haired teenage boy, and they arrived in a blue school bus. The Shanti Sena followed Ramos back to his bus and banged on the door. When he opened it, they found him inside with the teenage boy and a little boy he had met at the gathering. Ramos swore that he hadn't touched the child, but the Shanti Sena didn't believe him. They took photographs of Ramos and the teenager and warned him to stay away from the children. Despite the warning, the Shanti Sena still had their suspicion about Ramos, and at least one of them believed that Ramos was out there scouting out children he could kidnap or sell. The Rainbow family gathering continued, but Ramos left, only with his dog. By now, the Shanti Sena had decided to notify the police. State troopers caught up with Ramos near Route 80 in Shippensville, Pennsylvania. He was arrested and charged with involuntary deviate sexual intercourse, statutory rape, and indecent assault. He confessed to sexually assaulting the child in the bus, but because the police failed to read him his Miranda rights, the confession had to be thrown out and the case was dropped. Although Ramos wasn't arrested then, the following year he was convicted of molesting 2 young boys in Erie and sentenced to prison at Rockview State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. And that's how Ramos came to be at the place where he would later be interrogated about Etan Patz. Ramos's blue bus, which was impounded by the police in Shippensville, was declared abandoned and sold to a salvage dealer. He towed it away and cleaned out all the contents. Among those contents was his diary, which was tossed in the fire along with other trash that Ramos had left behind. Unfortunately, because the diary was burnt, we would never know what was written on it. No matter how many times Ramos was asked about Etan, he always said he had no idea where that boy was. Grabois found out that the charges against Ramos were dropped at the Warren County, Pennsylvania on technicality. He was not happy. He made a promise to Ramos that if Ramos didn't start cooperating with him, he would get himself deputized in the state of Pennsylvania and try his case there. To Ramos's surprise, he did exactly that. When Ramos was taken back to Rockview, Grabois got ready for his legal debut in Pennsylvania. Around the same time, Shanti Sena gave Grabois a Polaroid of what they had taken. That is Ramos and the teenager, As soon as Grabois saw the picture, he was afraid to think or even ask. All these years with Ramos, could that teenager have been Etan? He later fed that image of young Etan into the computer and did an age progression image to see how Etan would look as a teenager. The images were shockingly similar. Grabois was almost certain that this was Etan. Despite all this, he didn't want to jump into any conclusions, so he decided on tracking down this teenager. He found out from Shanti Sena that the teenager's parents ran the orphanage. Upon further investigation, he found out that the boy was adopted. And this could have been the perfect cover story. Etan was missing and now someone adopted him. There's no idea of where this boy actually came from. So it kind of made the perfect cover story. Grabois needed more proof. After much research, he found out that the teenager was once arrested, which meant that the fingerprints were on file. He checked and compared them to Etan and was immediately disappointed because they didn't match. He even obtained DNA evidence from the teenager, hoping it would match to Etan. But that too was a dead end. The boys looked a lot similar, but they were two completely different boys. Grabois' investigators located the little boy who had been in the bus with Ramos and discovered that he had indeed been molested by Ramos. Grabois figured that even if he couldn't solve Etan Patz's case, he could at least put Ramos behind bars for another one. After all, he did hurt kids, even if it was not Etan. The trial began in October of 1990. Ramos, now clean-shaven with short hair, spoke to reporters as if he was insane. He invited them to shrimp dinner at jail. In a letter to the judge, he admitted his crime and asked that the child he had molested to be not put through the anguish of speaking out in court. A plea bargain was worked out and Ramos was sentenced to 10 to 20 years on top of his existing sentence. This was said to be the strictest punishment that could be allowed. Etan's body was never found and he was legally declared dead in 2001. In 2004, his parents, Stan and Julie Patz, pursued and won a civil case against Ramos, alleging that he was responsible for their son's disappearance. Ramos was ordered to pay a sum of $2 million, but the Patz family never collected it. Ramos served a 20-year prison sentence and was released in 2012. However, soon after his release, he was arrested once again for Megan's Law violation. Now, if you don't know, Megan's Law is a federal law that requires states to establish and maintain a sex offender registry. If a prior sex offender comes and starts living in your area, then a notification has to be sent to all the people living in that street. Megan's Law requires states to provide public information about the sex offender, including their names, addresses, criminal histories, anything that can help them out. This law was named after a girl named Megan Kanka, a 7-year-old girl who was raped and murdered by a sex offender who lived across her street. All because the family had no idea that the person living near them was a sex offender. Every year on Etan's birthday and the anniversary of his disappearance, Stan Patz sent Ramos a copy of his son's missing child poster with the message, quote, "What did you do to my little boy?" End quote, typed on the back. The case took a huge turn on May 24, 2010, when New York Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly announced that a man was in custody, and this man had implicated himself in Etan's disappearance. The man was 51-year-old Pedro Hernandez of Maple Shade, New Jersey. He reportedly confessed to strangling the 6-year-old boy, stating in a written confession to the police, quote, "I'm sorry, I shock him." End quote. Hernandez was an 18-year-old convenience store worker in the neighborhood bodega at the time of Etan's disappearance. According to Hernandez, Etan had planned to buy a soda to drink with his lunch. He had $1 in hand which his mother had given him. Hernandez later said that he took Etan back with him to his house and then disposed of his remains in the garbage. He was charged with second-degree murder, and at the time of his arrest, there was no physical evidence to corroborate his confession. In December of 2012, Pedro Hernandez pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of murder and 1 count of kidnapping in the New York court. In April of 2013, his criminal defense lawyer, Harvey, filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the confession in one of the nation's most notorious child disappearances was false and made after 7 hours of police questioning. But in the May of the same year, New York Supreme Court Justice Maxwell Wiley ruled that the evidence was legally sufficient to support the charges and ordered a hearing to determine whether Hernandez's statement could be used at the trial. The hearing, which took place in September of 2014, focused on whether the statement that Hernandez made was before he was read out his Miranda rights or after. Because if it was before, then there was no point. It couldn't be legally used. The hearing also aimed to determine whether Hernandez understood the importance of these Miranda rights. This was also significant because later on Hernandez could not say that he didn't understand or he wasn't read out his rights. The actual truth or falsehood of the statements was not the focus of the hearing. The trial began on January 5th, 2015, and the question of the statement's truthfulness was to be discussed during the trial. After a mistrial in May 2015 due to a hung jury, Pedro faced a retrial in October 2016. Jury began deliberation in February of 2017, and on February 4th of that year, Hernandez was found guilty of kidnapping and felony murder. Sentencing was scheduled to February 28th, with Hernandez facing up to 25 years to life in prison. His attorneys were granted a delay to challenge the verdict, and no new sentencing date was set. Finally, on April 28, 2017, Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 25 years. The extensive media attention given to Etan's disappearance has been credited with creating greater attention to missing children. This attention has led to several changes, such as less willingness to allow children to walk to school alone, photos of missing children that appeared on milk cartons or any other items, and promotion of the concept of stranger danger. That is, adults making sure that their children would not just walk home with anyone. Stan and Julie Patz had the 2004 judgment against Ramos dismissed after the 2015 trial of Pedro Hernandez. The Patz family finally had some closure with the conviction of Hernandez, who had confessed to killing his son after a long legal battle. Hernandez's conviction brought justice to the family and brought attention to all those missing children. The program of missing children was widespread, but now let's come to why was this program stopped? So when talking about the Milk Carton Kids program, then you know that the faces of children were not only on milk cartons. They were posted on billboards, grocery bags, pizza boxes, almost anywhere possible. So when you look at it, it's kind of a win because people always saw these children, so they knew exactly how these children looked like. But also there was kind of a loss in the situation. Starting with the parents. It was kind of a loss with the parents, not of the children, but other parents of other children, because first they were afraid that what if something like this happened to their child. So that constant fear was there within them not allowing them to give the child the freedom that the child wanted, especially not allowing their children to go out and play alone or to faraway places. But as time passed, that kind of changed. Parents started seeing more and more pictures. The children's pictures kept changing, the dates kept changing, the reasons kept changing. It was all missing children with different children on different milk cartons. So after a certain period of time, parents started to detach themselves from these milk cartons. It kind of became like a picture, a new kind of norm, a picture on the side of a milk carton. That's it. They knew why the picture was there, but that importance was kind of lost in the way. Now when you come to children, a small child sitting and having breakfast and having to see another child of their age on the side of a milk carton with big letters of missing written on it kind of scared them. Every time they saw this milk carton, a thought was built into them that it could be them, that they also could go missing under such mysterious circumstances. So as much as the parents were happy that it wasn't their child on the side of a milk carton, it made the children equally scared, knowing that there was another child out there, their age, who was missing. Also, let's talk about the numbers, the number of children that went missing. Now, not all children who went missing actually went missing. So at times, parents would go to the grocery store and suddenly they would realize that they have lost their child. They would go into this panic mode and think that maybe someone took away their child, and they would start panicking. But that child was not actually missing. That child would have wandered off somewhere. Similarly, there were also young teenagers who wanted to have a fun night. They would be out late at night or maybe out even for several days. The parents had no idea where their kids were. They would be afraid, they would call the cops, everything would go on, and before the child even knew it, their picture would be at the side of a milk carton. The child would later come back and everything would be sorted. But by then, the picture was already there on the side of a milk carton and people would be looking for that child. Now, all of this does not mean that children were not being kidnapped. There were a lot of children being kidnapped, being murdered, but the exact number of those is hard to find. And in these numbers, we also have these stereotypical abductions. If you don't know what a stereotypical abduction is, it is when a child is kidnapped, kept overnight, and then let go. It is still a tragedy, but compared to the children who never reached home, this is a very low number. Also, most of the children that went missing belonged to divorced parents. In these cases, the parents would have a joint custody of a child for a certain period of time, and maybe this parent would keep this child with them for a little bit longer, and the other parent had no idea where this child was. This led to a missing complaint, and then once again, the picture on the side of a milk carton. And during this whole missing child phase, parents started freaking out during Halloween. This was the time when children would dress up, go to strangers' houses and ask for candy. Schools were shut down, sporting activities were not allowed, children were not allowed to go out alone. They had to come home right after school because the parents were afraid of those strangers lurking in the dark. This whole time, having a missing child's face plastered on a milk carton would be sitting there on the table, right next to the child, who is now having breakfast, afraid of what might happen to them. Sometimes parents would freak out to this extent that they would even go on to tell the kids about human trafficking rings and what would happen to them if they didn't listen to them. All of this just inflicted trauma on the kids. Now we all know that if a kid goes missing, the first 48 hours are the most crucial time to finding a child. If a parent wants a child found, then the first 48 hours are the most important hours of their life. With the Milk Carton Program, what happened was that a child had to be first identified as a missing child, and that would only happen after 48 hours. Then the photo would be sent to the press, then printed on the side of a milk carton, then delivered to the families. Right now, the scenario is completely different. When a child is missing, the cops immediately get to it. But back then, there was a certain procedure that had to be followed. And by the time this procedure was followed, it would already be too late. A majority of child murders happened shortly after abduction. So the whole point of having this picture on the side of a milk carton didn't make sense because the child would already be dead by then. That is, if that's what the killer wanted to do. Like I said, there were also certain success stories. Bonnie Lawman was abducted from her father by her mother and stepfather. Since she was not taken by any stranger, her case was not a typical abduction case. But her father somehow managed to put a photo on the side of a milk carton. Bonnie was abducted at the age of 3. She lived in Spain as well as Hawaii with her mother and stepfather. She was not allowed to roam outdoors, and as she grew, her stepfather gave her more and more freedom. One day, while she was visiting the grocery store, she saw her photo on the side of a milk carton. She was surprised, and she requested her stepfather that she wanted to keep this picture of hers. She had no idea that the words missing, what they meant. She was a small child. Her stepfather was good enough to buy the milk carton to her. He cut out Bonnie's image and let her save it. Bonnie was warned by her stepfather to keep the image a secret. But one day, Bonnie accidentally left this picture in her neighbor's house along with a bag of toys. As soon as the neighbor saw the missing sign on top of Bonnie's image, the neighbor called the police and Bonnie was reunited with her father. Now, Bonnie's case is one of the very rare cases where a missing child was actually found through a milk carton program. Another issue that came up with the milk carton program was that it catered mostly towards white children. Children of color or indigenous children were not featured on the milk carton program. And you can understand how the audience felt about this. Adam Garfinkel, a historian, noted that over the years, the government began to offer tax breaks to dairies who would feature these kids on the side of their milk carton, because this was seen as a public service to them. Usually on the side of milk cartons, you would have an ad, so that would be profitable to the dairies. But when a picture of a child was put up, this was just a public service. Now, once the government started giving them more tax breaks, it became quite popular and dairies started doing this more and more. But hats off to those dairies who decided to do it long before the government gave them any benefits. They were doing this out of their own pocket. The Missing Children Milk Carton Program came to an end in 1996 with the invention of Amber Alert. The Amber Alert program allows authorities to give real-time updates on the children's descriptions and whatever was happening, and the description of their captors and the vehicles. Even if the milk carton program did not achieve the success that it was intended to do, it contributed a lot to the society. If there was no milk carton program, there would be no Amber Alert and no kids would be saved today. So whatever is happening today, all the kids that are being saved, it's all thanks to the milk carton program that started. With the invention of Amber Alert in 1996, many believe that Molly Bish in 2000 was said to be the last child ever to be featured on a milk carton. But sadly, as with many children featured on milk cartons, her body would be found 3 years later. I feel like the milk carton program is quite fascinating because you have a lot of programs for adults, but it's very rare that you see something for children. You have missing persons cases, you have adults and children together, but there was no separate case for children. But after the milk carton program came in, the focus went on to children, the ones that needed the most help. So what do you think about the milk carton program?
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. It really helps me reach new listeners. If you have a true crime story or a case that you'd like me to cover on a future episode, please send in an email. I'll link it in the description. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the 3am Fear podcast so you do not miss any future episodes. You can find my YouTube and social media links in the description box so you're always updated on what I'm up. If you love thrillers, I have a free thriller ebook listed in the description. Do check it out. Until then, stay kind and stay safe out there. See you next week.